So I look at what happens to civilians in armed conflict and how to protect them better. What I'm really interested in is whether the rules of war, like the Geneva Conventions, can help mitigate the effects of war on civilians. So I look at all kinds of things, like where these rules come from and why we have some rules but not others, how well they work, and also how they can be improved. And I track and I analyze efforts by governments and activists to strengthen the rules, to make them stronger, and also to implement them better. And why does this matter? Well, because protecting civilians depends on those kinds of efforts, and sometimes you need science to know how well they're working, because sometimes well-intentioned efforts can actually backfire. So my new book that I just published is about why some problems affecting civilians in conflict don't get much policy attention by governments. They're required not to target civilians on purpose. There's no law that says they can't hurt them accidentally. And there's no law that says they even have to compensate civilians who are accidentally harmed, even though we have lots of other kinds of laws. So this book talks about what happens when activists try to fill gaps in the rules, and also how the strategies they use in global networks can make that job harder or easier. So, for example, I tell stories about activists that are campaigning to ban the use of killer robots, which are autonomous weapons that can fire themselves and maybe don't even know how to tell a civilian from a combatant. So the book is about which strategies work best to get new rules on the books. You can't close a gap in the laws of war if you don't recognize the gap, and you can't get governments to recognize that gap unless you do advocacy in ways that make governments listen. But it also matters what kinds of rules you build and what kinds of enforcement mechanisms they have. So lots of rules are on the books that don't work very well. My new research project, what I'm working on now, is looking at a different kind of gap in the laws of war, which is the monitoring of civilian deaths. So in other words, we have a rule already that says civilian harm should be minimized, but there's no requirement to keep track of actually how many civilians we're hurting or killing in our wars, to see whether well-meaning governments are actually achieving that goal. This means we don't really know how well our smart bombs work, or how many civilians require aid, or where the world's worst hotspots are, or even whether the policies we design to protect civilians, like humanitarian intervention, actually result in fewer deaths. And there's no official organization whose job it is to do those kinds of body counts, and governments aren't required to do them. So instead what you have is a lot of ad hoc attempts to count civilian casualties by NGOs and think tanks and independent experts. And it's kind of a fascinating cottage industry at the intersection of science and politics. So understanding how that industry works and how to do civilian casualty counting better matters, because if you can't measure a problem well, then it's really hard to solve it.